Okay, we are 1 hour into bulk fermentation. This is round 2 of our stretching and folding for loaf number 1. This is our standard tartine loaf. I can already see some bubbles, activity on the top of the dough that implies the fermentation is active. So now let's pause for a minute that we're into round 2 and think about where are we trying to go with the bulk fermentation for each loaf. So for loaf number 1, I have to think about where did I come from. So I skipped the Autolyse, I did minimal mixing of the dough for the Fermentolyse, and I did a minimal mixing of the dough for adding the salt. So when I'm into stretch and fold, I gotta work the dough. I mean, I just haven't worked the dough yet. So in terms of gluten development, I gotta dig in here and really work this. So on round 2, stretch and fold for loaf number 1, I need to apply this kinetic energy to the loaf to really continue working the dough. This is not gentle handling. This is really working it. I'm getting a good stretch there on round 2. And then on the third stretch, it really tightens up. So this is where I'm gonna stop with that third fold, and I'm not gonna do 4. And this goes back to the way that we're counting the number of layers that we're creating. So in this case, I just created 7 layers by doing those 3 folds. If I had forced this and tried to turn that 4th fold, I would have created 15 layers. I would have really created more density in the loaf. And I'm not trying to create density, I'm trying to create airiness. So this is a trade-off between stretching the dough to build the gluten, but not overworking the dough because then you'll create that density. Back in the proofing chamber. Loaf number 2, round 2. This is my slightly modified tartine. Where am I coming from and where am I going to? I did a little bit more aggressive handling on the front end. So we saw in that first stretch, I have good gluten development in here already. So I'm gonna do another, I'd say moderate stretch and fold here on round 2, but I'm not gonna work it as hard as I did in loaf number 1 because I've already worked the dough coming into this. So I can back off a little bit. That dough feels really nice and supple. Really getting a great stretch up out of the bowl there. I'm not really pulling very hard at all. And then on the third turn, it's coming up out of the bowl. I'm going to stop with the third turn on this one as well. I'm not going to try to force that 4th fold. Back into the proofing chamber. Loaf number 3, round number 2. Now, if we think about where we've come from, I did a huge amount of gluten development up front on this. So now that I'm in bulk fermentation, I'm really turning the dough to help aerate the dough. It's going to help the yeast do its job, but I really don't need to apply a lot of energy to these folds because I already applied so much early on. So I'm really just aerating, folding, trying to build some height, but this is not about stretching and working the dough at this point. I mean, if you look at the way this dough is setting up, this is our second stretch and fold on loaf number 3. This looks like the way the dough looks on the last stretch and fold of loaf number 1, the typical tartine fold. I mean, the dough would be a little bit more aerated, but when you think about the development of the gluten, the way this is really smoothed out, it's pulling away from the sides of the bowl. It's maintaining those finger marks in there. This dough is pretty far along, so I don't want to overdo it. I'm helping the yeast here by aerating and turning because the yeast can't swim. It's only going to eat the starches and flours that are adjacent to it. So by moving the dough, you're actually helping accelerate the fermentation process a little bit. There's 3 folds. I don't want to do the 4th either with this one because it's really going to overwork the dough. So this is all about gentle handling. And this is the last of the standard stretch and folds that I'm going to do for this loaf. When we move forward now, I'm going to start doing coil folds. So I'm going to move this into this low flat container, which is more of the traditional vessel that you would use for coil folding. And you'll see why, because we really want this to spread out more into a flat rectangle. Let's just do a temperature check. This loaf is sitting at 81 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 27.2 degrees Celsius. I'm going to keep this in the proofing chamber. I like to push these right up to about 82 degrees Fahrenheit or 27.8 degrees Celsius. If it starts to go over 82, I'll leave these on the countertop, but I'm going to keep going right now. Okay, we are 90 minutes into bulk fermentation. We are on round 3 of our stretch and folds. This is loaf number 1. So what do I want to be thinking about at this point, 1.5 hours into bulk fermentation? An important thing is I need to start thinking about measuring the percent rise in my dough. I actually thought about that before I started, and I marked this vessel on the side so I could see what our starting point was. The Tartine recipe calls for a 20 to 30% rise in the dough, which is relatively small when you think about it. And there's always been some debate whether you should start that at the beginning, measuring it from the very start, or if that 20 to 30% rise is after you've done the stretch and folds and you're looking for the finished, what I call the finish rise. It's still unclear to me. I look at it both ways. I look at exactly where I start. I look at what the height is after the last stretch and fold, and I approximate 20 to 30% off of both of those, and I make a judgment call, and I'll explain to you how I do that. I wish it could be more precise, but it's really not. The other thing that I want to look at this point, now that I'm 90 minutes in, is my gluten development on my number 1 loaf. So I'm going to pull a window pane and see where we are. I just reach down into the dough. I stretch it up. That's pretty good gluten development right there. I mean, that's pretty thin and it's not ripping. It eventually will start to rip around the edges like that because we're using whole wheat flour in the dough. So the bran actually acts like little knives and it will cut through that gluten membrane. But that was a pretty good stretch for gluten development for the window pane after 2 stretch and folds basically. So this dough is developing nicely. I'm going to continue with the standard stretch and fold here. Now this is the 3rd time around. I'm still giving it a pretty good pull because on loaf number 1, I still need to do some development of the dough here. Now this is tightening up quite a bit. So this is where I really need to be careful how many times I fold this. So I did 1 fold, I do 2 folds, and I can't even really get a 3rd fold out of this. I'm going to try to get that gluten to relax a little bit. That's it. So I feel like I'm really manhandling this dough right now, but it's still relatively early in bulk fermentation. We're 3 folds in, and again, this is the loaf that needs the hands-on work for the development, so I'm going to let that go now. Let's do a temperature test. 82 degrees, right where we want to be. And when I talked about measuring the percent rise, in this bowl that I'm using for loaf number 1, this has the liter markers on it. I marked it exactly where I started. And when you look at the percent rise, you want to do that as a percent of volume, not as a percentage of height. So a lot of people will use a straight walled container. A lot of people use the Cambro containers where the height equals the volume because the walls are perfectly straight. In this type of vessel or in a bowl where it flares out at the top, the height isn't equal to the volume. So you have to look at your liter markers on the side because the volume increases faster than the height as it flares out at the top. So I'm also using this loaf number 1 as what some people would call an aliquot. Aliquot is where you can take a small sample of your dough and put it in another small vessel and leave that in your proofing chamber with your dough so that you can more clearly see how the dough is rising without the impact of handling. I'm using a little bit of a hybrid method here where I'm just going to measure the height off of this vessel because I use this all the time and I have my liter markers on here, and I'm going to assume that this percent rise applies to loaf number 2 and loaf number 3, which I'm going to leave in a flatter bottomed vessel, which is, it's almost impossible to measure a 20 to 30% rise when you have something sitting in a big flat vessel like the bowl or the flat dish that I'm using. Loaf number 2. Now on this loaf you can see I'm using this big bowl and the dough is really spreading out in the bottom of the bowl between each rest, between each fold. Does this really impact the nature of the stretching and folding, it may. The tartine recipe calls for doing the stretching and folding in a tall, straight-walled vessel, more like the one I'm using on loaf number 1. I'm just trying something different here because later in the process I'm also going to do what I call the upside-down coil folds here, so I need more of a flat bottom bowl. But this is interesting as well because just having a flatter bottom bowl, it allows the dough to relax more between the stretch and folds. And that relaxation of the dough is part of the stretching and folding process. I mean, people call it stretch and fold, but one step or one rotation of that is really stretch, fold, and relax. It's that whole cycle that you have to think about because you don't want to stretch and fold until the dough has relaxed. So before we do the folds on loaf number 2, let's do a window pane test and see where we are with gluten development. I mean, that's really excellent. I mean, I have translucency, huge stretch. I mean, in terms of gluten development, it doesn't get a lot better than that. I don't have much further to go. So now at this point, for loaf number 2, because I have sufficient gluten development, I don't need to work the dough as much. So now I can really focus on more gentle folding of the dough to build that structural height, to build the architecture of the loaf, and not really work the dough like a diving arm mixer. I don't need to do that anymore because I have good gluten here. So I'm just going to carefully do a stretch and fold on this one. Where I'm just lifting and layering over on itself. That's already forming into a pretty nice looking ball of dough in the bowl. So we're getting some height, but it's incredibly irregular. So going forward, I want to try to organize this a little bit more with my folds going forward. Loaf number 3 is relaxing in this big flat bottom dish. This is part of the process going forward. We're going to start with coil folds on loaf number 3 in round number 3. Now the reason I'm switching to coil folds here is because the coil folds are a much more gentle method of handling the dough. I don't need to do any more gluten development on this. I could tell from the first stretch. Let's just do a window pane just to verify. This dough is incredibly supple, incredibly thin, translucent, beautiful gluten right there. I mean, that's amazing. So my gluten development is sufficient. So all I'm focused on now is continuing to move the dough a little bit to help it ferment, because that movement of the dough does help the yeast do the fermentation. But now I'm really focused on building structure. I want to build layers and height so that I'm starting to form my final loaf. So we will do the first coil fold on this one. When I do a coil fold, I reach down towards the front 1/3 of the dough here. I lift it up, I let gravity flop that first third under. I turn the bowl 180 degrees. I now grab the front third, which used to be the back third. I lift that up. I'm getting a little bit more stretch on that than I really want and need. I didn't need to do that much. I fold that under. Now I turn it 90 degrees. That's my first coil. If you looked at it down the loaf, it looks like a Swiss roll. Now I do another coil fold. This is shorter because I'm on the shorter dimension of the pan. Fold it under, turn 180 degrees, fold it under. There's my second coil. If you look down the loaf, it looks like a tube. So as I mentioned before, technically this should be called a double coil fold because we did 2 coils, but this is your coil fold. And then what you see here with the coil fold as compared to the other 2 is I'm starting to build the shape of a loaf. I mean, I'm building some height here, I'm building some architecture in the dough, and I'm going to carry this through all the way into pre-shaping and final shaping. So in bulk fermentation, there are 3 dimensions. There's the aeration of the dough that the yeast is doing, there's the gluten development that you're doing by stretching the dough, and there's the structure development that you're doing by folding the dough. All 3 of these dimensions interact with each other. I'll give an example of how that works. If you think of making ceramics or pottery on a wheel, there are 3 things going on here. One is you have to spin the wheel at the proper speed to get the clay to open up. That's essentially the same as the fermentation process. By fermenting the dough at the proper temperature, you're allowing the yeast to basically open up the dough. That's the same as the wheel spinning. If that spins too fast, it will fly apart. That's the equivalent of overproofing. If it's spinning too slowly, that's the equivalent of underproofing. You end up with a ball of clay on your wheel and it cannot open up because the wheel's not spinning fast enough. The second thing that's happening is as you're spinning the wheel and you want to open up the middle of the clay, you need to put pressure on the inside of the bowl. So that's essentially the equivalent of the stretching process. You're stretching, 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 where you're building the sides of the bowl up, but you're pushing out on it. If you stretch too far, it will collapse. If you don't stretch far enough, it won't open up. That's what gives you your open crumb, is that stretching, a gentle stretching of the dough that builds the gluten matrix. And then the third dimension is the outside pressure, where you have to put some pressure on the outside of the bowl as it's spinning to build the side walls and build the height. That's the equivalent of the folds in bulk fermentation. When you fold the dough over, you're building these structural edges in the dough that are helping to build the height. So you need all three of those dimensions. The continuous spinning creates the fermentation and the aeration. The inside pressure is the stretching. The outside pressure is the folding. You have to get all three of those to work perfectly together. We are 2 hours into bulk fermentation. This is round 4. This will be the 4th fold on loaf number 1. If I take a look at the dough, it's definitely starting to rise. I can see it doming up on top, and the top looks much smoother. So we're getting that fermentation activity in there. This is our 4th fold. Interestingly, this is where I used to stop in the past based on that original interpretation of tartine. We're going to continue through 6 folds today and see how that works. But when we get to fold 4, 5, 6, you really want to start doing these more gently now. We proved in the last round that we had good gluten development when we pulled a window pane on this. So now I'm just continuing to turn the dough. It helps to aerate the dough, keeps the yeast doing its job, which we're really shifting the bulk of the responsibility for here to finish out bulk fermentation is more of a biological process. And I'm just going to continue to build some structure of the loaf by lifting and gently folding this over. And again, I'm just doing 3 folds on these instead of 4 because I would really be aggressively working that dough. This is because I'm working with a smaller mass of dough. 3 may even be too much. I mean, it feels like I'm really working this quite a bit. If this were 1,000 grams of flour weight, this would be filled up almost to the top. You just have a lot more dough to work with. So we'll put this back in the proofing chamber. Okay, loaf number 2 for round number 4. I'm going to shift away from the stretch and folds now, and I'm going to do what I call an upside down coil fold. This is something that I invented, or at least invented calling it the upside down coil fold. Rather than moving this into another flat bottom pan and doing that turn under the way that you do with the coil fold, I'm just going to imagine this is upside down, and you grab the front third, fold it to the center. That dough looks beautiful. It's really thick. Turn it 180 degrees, grab the back third, fold that over the top. That's exactly like the first coil fold. If you look through the bottom of that clear pan, that's what it would look like. Turn it 90 degrees, fold this third towards the center. This is really getting tall now. Turn it 180 degrees, fold this side towards the center. There it is. That's essentially a coil fold upside down. Maybe it's not as neat as the other one, but I'm not dirtying another dish. I can mix stretch and folds and coil folds in the same vessel, but I'm really building height to the dough, and I'm treating it much more gently than if I did stretch and folds. Loaf number 3. So we already did 1 coil fold on this. I'm actually going to let this relax for another round. As I mentioned, the stretching and folding, it's really a three-part process. It's stretch, fold, relax. The relaxation is an important part of the stretching and folding because you want to let those gluten strands really stretch out so you get a lot of structure on the next turn. Otherwise, you're just using shorter strands of gluten to try to build your structure, and if you really let them stretch out, you'll get more structure, in my mind. That's what I'm seeing here. So I'm going to let this sit for another 30 minutes. The rests are important. It's just like in music, you have notes and rests. The rests are part of the song. The times where you don't play the music are as important as the times when you do play the music. It's the same thing with this. You can't just plow through and keep stretching, folding, stretching, and folding. We're going to do stretch, fold, rest, stretch, fold, rest. That sounds like a Queen song. Okay, we're going to put this back in the proving chamber. Okay, we are 2.5 hours into bulk fermentation. This is round 5, so this will be our 5th stretch and fold. The dough is doming up. I'm seeing some air bubbles on the top, so the fermentation is kicking in here. So at this point, 2.5 hours in, we're really past the halfway point of bulk fermentation. And in terms of the dough handling for all the loaves, we really want to be thinking about bringing these in for a soft landing now. You don't want to do a lot of heavy handling late in bulk fermentation because it degasses the dough. So when you get past the halfway point of bulk fermentation, you're really doing a handoff to the yeast to really finish the job. The bulk fermentation, when you think about the way that the yeast fills the gluten matrix with carbon dioxide, that's not a linear process. It's more of an exponential curve like this, where as the yeast is producing and reproducing, it actually accelerates its fermentation right towards the end. So we've done a lot of the handling here up to now. We want to be incredibly gentle and let the yeast really get that last rise here over the next, say, 90 minutes or so. So the 5th stretch and fold, very gentle. Now you can see this dough on stretch and fold number 5 looked like one of my very early folds on one of the other batches that I mentioned, where you can see the dough standing up, you see the finger marks in it. So this just takes a little bit longer to develop, but it gets there. This is really soft and supple. I can barely do that 3rd turn. In fact, I'm not going to do the 3rd turn on this one. The dough really pulled back from me when I got ready to do the 3rd turn. I'm just working with this small mass of dough, so I don't want to overdo it. Loaf number 2, we did our upside down coil fold on the last round. So at this point in bulk fermentation, you just have to size up, what have I accomplished to this point in the process? How much time do I have remaining? And how much more folding do I want to do here? So I've done 4 folds so far. I think I want to do 5 or 6 before I'm completely done. And that's really just following the general guidance of Tartine, which recommends 6. I have roughly 90 minutes left. We're 2.5 hours through bulk fermentation. The recommended end time is 4 hours. I definitely don't want to be handling the dough really late in the process, and definitely not after 4 hours. So I'm really just doing a simple calculation in my mind of I have 3 more time slots to work in. I want to do 2 more folds. I'm going to pass on this one. Then I'm going to do 2 more coil folds closer to the end of the process, purely based on intuition. I have no scientific means for why I'm doing that. It just feels like with this loaf, I want to try doing what I'd call a strong finish on this and handle this and get this a little bit tighter towards the end of bulk fermentation. Totally personal preference. So loaf number 3, 2.5 hours in, we let this rest for an hour after the last coil fold. You can see it really relaxed out to the edges of the bowl, which is what I was hoping. And you can see this is really puffed up and aerating. So I'm letting the yeast do the work here by not touching this. So when you're in bulk fermentation, I think of this as kind of a dance between yourself and the yeast. I mean, when you get in here with your hands and really start working the dough, you're taking away all that work that the yeast did. The yeast is trying to puff out the carbon dioxide to aerate the dough, and then you dig in there with your big hands and you're degassing the dough every time you touch it. So occasionally I'll just kind of step aside and let the yeast do its job for an hour, and then I'll come back and put my hands in here again. So that's all I did here, was I kind of passed the baton to the yeast for an hour. It did a nice job. I got to step back in and build a little more structure. When this sits for a long time, it wants to stick to the bottom of the pan, which then causes more stretching when I'm trying to pull this out of the dish, which I don't really want right now. I don't want stretching. I just want folding. So I'm just adding a little water around the edges here to try to minimize the grip on the pan, to see if I can get this up and out without a lot of extra unwanted stretching. I grab the front third. This is really soft, extensible dough, really loose. I grab the back third. See, I got that huge stretch again, which I didn't want. The dough feels incredibly soft and supple. A lot of fermentation activity happening here. So this is proofing up nicely. That dough looks pretty good, 2.5 hours in. That's a lot of activity, and that dough is pretty active. Now my proofing chamber is 85 degrees. These loaves are getting up to 85, so I'm gonna get them out of the proofing chamber now because they overshot the target. I was trying to keep them at 82. Took my eye off the ball for a couple minutes. Let me get these out. That one's at 84. So all these loaves overshot the target a little bit of 82. So I'm gonna hit the brakes here, pull these out, leave them on the countertop, try to get them back in that target range of 78 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 25.5 to 27.8 degrees Celsius. These are up pushing 29 degrees Celsius, where I don't want them to be right now. So I'm gonna try to dial things down here, slow things down a little bit, but we're still okay. Okay, we are 3 hours into bulk fermentation. This is our last stretch and fold on loaf number 1. I'm just checking. I do see some fermentation activity, some bubbles around the edges. I'm getting some rise off of my line here. I put a piece of tape on my bowl at the beginning of the process. It's looking pretty good. Last stretch and fold, very gentle. This dough feels beautiful. I just tried to pull that up into a ball, kind of went around the edges, not really following the standard stretch and fold method, but I'm trying to get some height here in the dough, as this will be the last time that I touch this. Loaf number 2, I did one upside down coil fold an hour ago, so this is fully relaxed now, which is what I wanted it to do. I'm going to do another one of these upside down coil folds right in this bowl. Lift that top third over, turn, lift that third over. That's really sitting up nice and tall. Lift that third over. That's a really proud, nice ball of dough. Loaf number 3, I did a coil fold 30 minutes ago. This hasn't fully relaxed yet. I'm gonna let that go another 30 minutes, and then we'll do one final coil fold on loaf number 3. Now, according to the Tartine recipe, it indicates that this could be the earliest that you would finish bulk fermentation. The way that you would be done with bulk fermentation is that you would see a 20 to 30% rise in the dough. I'm not really near 30% yet, which is what I usually go for. But if you had a super strong starter, I guess it's possible that you could be done in 3 hours. In all my experience following this recipe, I've never hit the target percent rise after 3 hours. So we'll keep going. Okay, we're 3.5 hours into bulk fermentation. Let's take a look at how the dough looks. For loaf number 1, we're done with our 6 stretch and folds. You can see this is domed up on the top in this tall, narrow vessel. Loaf number 2, I just did my second upside down coil fold 30 minutes ago. That's still maintaining its shape, nice, round, and tall. So that's really keeping some structure. Loaf number 3, I did a second coil fold on this 1 hour ago, and I'm going to do a third coil fold on it now. You can see this did not relax as much as it did during the prior 1 hour wait, so this is maintaining some of its structure as well. So loaf 1, done handling. Loaf 2, I'm still keeping an option to do another fold on that. Loaf 3, this will probably be the last fold. We're 3.5 hours into bulk fermentation. I rarely handle the dough this deep into the bulk fermentation process, but I'm just trying a couple of different things today to see what happens here. The reason I'm somewhat comfortable handling this dough late in the process is because I'm handling it so gently. We did all that heavy lifting at the beginning, really worked the dough. So when you get deep into the bulk fermentation process, normally where I'd say hands off the dough, don't touch it. If you can do this gently, it might work. We'll find out. Now the issue I've had with this is it's sticking to the bottom and I'm getting a lot more stretching than what I really want. So I'm just doing a little bit of lubrication around the sides here with wet fingers to hopefully release this from the pan. That's a nice looking loaf. Okay, front third, up and under, perfect. Back third, now in the front, up and under, perfect. So that worked perfectly. Now I get my side turn, fold under, this side, fold under. That's a perfect coil fold right there. Okay, so I believe this will be the last one for this loaf. I'm gonna cover this and let that continue to rise. Let's check our dough temperatures to see if these need to go back into the proofing chamber. That's sitting at 79 degrees, so that temperature came down pretty quickly since I took these out. I want to keep these around 80, so I may put these back into the proofing chamber. I'll check the temperature in my oven. Yeah, these still need some time to rise. These are probably going to go another hour, so I'm going to put these back into the proofing chamber for that final finish and let the yeast do its job at a very comfortable working temperature. Okay, we were 4 hours into bulk fermentation. This is the outside estimate from the Tartine book of when bulk fermentation should be done. We're not there yet. This isn't a 20 to 30% rise yet. I'd say maybe 15%. It's difficult to tell because it's domed up in the middle. But normally this would be domed up more. It would have more bubbles on the top. It would be a little bit looser than what I'm seeing here. So I'm going to let that go another 30 minutes. The book indicates that you just have to wait for the rise and be flexible if the dough is not ready. I don't think it's ready, but it's close. Now, on loaf number 2, we only did 5 stretch and folds on this loaf. The recipe indicated 6. We said we were going to bend the rules but not break the rules. So with the other 2 loaves, I've handed everything off to the yeast. I'm done with my handling. I'm comfortable to let the yeast do its job. With this loaf, I want to keep following the rules. I want to do that 6 stretch and fold. This is for the people that just drive the speed limit, color between the lines in the coloring book. You got to get that 6 stretch and fold in. It happens. I mean, this is the personality of a person imbues itself in the loaf. I can't stop myself. I'm going to do the 6 stretch and fold, even though better judgment tells me not to. Now, 4 hours into bulk fermentation, I mean, I have no business touching this loaf, but I'm actually going to do it as an experiment to see what happens when you do really late handling in bulk fermentation. I think I know what happens is you probably will get a dense crumb, so I think we'll try something unique here and do one last gentle fold 4 hours into bulk fermentation. That dough feels really nice. So I got two kind of rollover folds there. I don't think I can do the top fold. So I'm just going to flip this in the bowl and try to tuck the sides under. There we go. That was kind of a modified fold. That's it. That loaf's done. We're just going to let everything continue to rise here. As I said before, I'm using number 1 as my benchmark because I have that in a container with the liter measurements on it. These other two I'm just eyeballing.